Hello everyone. As always, it is a pleasure to be here in front of you. Members, collaborators and friends of the Faro Foundation, which little by little is becoming a fundamental key in our great cultural battle. When I started to give the cultural battle, several years ago, I was an economist who lived from giving lectures and writing books. And many times I was more alone than I was on Mother's Day. Because defending liberalism publicly for those times was poorly seen. And there are few mediums or spaces in which to receive me. Not only that, I remember that at that time, during the lectures, I think that the elevator was too big for us. But luckily things changed for the better. Today I have a slightly more demanding job. And we are increasingly the ones who defend this cause. But I will never leave my role as a publicist of the ideas of freedom aside. In any case, now that I am president, my responsibility for freeing the cultural battle is even greater. Because the word of a president has a greater effect than that of a common citizen. And because in addition to being morally correct, giving the cultural battle contributes to the success of the reforms that we are carrying out from the government. Because social support makes our reforms sustainable in time, and makes it so that in the future the citizens themselves are the ones who defend their freedom, and do not let themselves be trampled on again by the socialists of good or bad manners. I say they are the very totalitarian and they are the friendly, but they are just as sinister. That is why I always say that the great gesture to change Argentina has three fronts of battle, which, although they are different from each other, are equally indispensable. The front of management to design and implement the deep reforms that the country needs. The front of politics, where we build the necessary institutional power to promote these reforms and sustain them politically. And of course the cultural battle, where we ensure that these changes are sustainable in the long time, but also in education. In other words, that those who have eyes begin to see it once and for all. This is precisely the case of the parallel of this week, which happened that says, "These are the words that Moses spoke to all the people of Israel." I say, of course I am not believing Moses, I warn you. I am only quoting the parallel of last week. Please, I clarify because no, because they saw that it seems that in Argentina, some would die of literality. So we say, I have to be careful until I make the quotes. But the wise men explained to us that the truths that Moses spoke must be seen and studied by us every day as something new. That is why the emphasis is on these words. To give context, this parallel begins in the fifth and last book of the Pentateuch, that is, the Torah, where the Hebrew people, having walked the desert for 40 years, were already very close to the promised land. And when they were about to arrive, just before that important moment, Moses repeats the events of the whole Exodus, reviewing with the people everything that happened until they arrived there, and accentuated the importance of living every day in a renewed way, the truths that allowed them to reach their destination, and that allowed them to achieve freedom. That is, notice that when entering the promised land, the Jewish people could begin to think that it would no longer be necessary to continue studying the Torah, since they had achieved their goal. However, Moses made it clear to them that when conquests are achieved, it is precisely when one cannot relax. There we must raise the guard even more and be even more applied. This reflection is fundamental to understand the cultural battle, because it teaches us that a political victory is not the end of the struggle for ideas, but the beginning of a new struggle to defend them. To accomplish a challenge means the emergence of a new challenge, and so on and so forth. This is very interesting because sometimes we are accused of systematically repeating the achievements. But sometimes one has a feeling that the task is underestimated, or that it has been forgotten that we are facing the abyss. That is, we assume the worst inheritance in the history of Argentina. We combine the crisis, for example, the monetary imbalance, in times of money overhang, worse than the one in 1975. That is, the previous one, the Rodriguez. We held a balance of the central bank, which was worse than the one Alfonsín had in the previous hyperinflation. And we also had social indicators that were worse than those of 2001. That is, we had the combination of all the evils. And the reality is that, in the face of such a titanic task, and I want to ask for an applause for our Minister of Economy, the best minister in the world, the Mayor of Chile. Sometimes it seems that they forget where we came from. So I think it's worth pointing it out. Because it seems that today so many complain about the state of the United States, for example. They are the same that in its time they vetoed. And they said that they were declaring the state's bankruptcy, and that they left cheap relations of $80, and that today they are above $320. That is, they multiplied by 4. There were salaries of $300, and now they are $1,100. And now they come to say, I don't know, come at the end of the month. Well, I say that we also agree that it is clear that the phrase, let's say, it sounds very interesting, let's say, to get sensitive, yes. And it is very interesting because if it were true, you would have to walk down the street and you would have to be full of corpses. If someone then began to seriously think, let's say, that's stupidity, because in the end, if it were true, the streets would be much more complicated. And it is also an insult to those who, let's say, obviously make a great effort to try to move forward by the honest way. It is clear. That way, let's say, the cookies and a large part of journalism did not know it. It is more clear. I remember the other day, there was a show where, in a television program, a journalist who, let's say, whenever he can speak badly of me, he does it. And one who, when the forced misinterpretation of my second speech of Davos was made, that they took a paragraph, took 2 out of the middle, left the last one to make me say something that I did not say. Let's say a person came out to defend me, yes. And it happens that another from Spain who was presenting his book, this journalist, he called him to tell him, no, how are you going to defend him? It's time to hit him now to turn him around. And then they passed a jute that said, for example, economic relief, this year inflation will not exceed 100%. How interesting, right? How they changed. Oh, I have a luxury visit. There is a luxury visit. He is filming. Now did he turn off the phone? But we have the honor of having here, stand up, the brother of Mike, Pablo Bogiano, the director of the orchestra. You are getting more and more like Muti. So we have to be aware of where we come from. And if it is necessary, we are going to have to continue repeating. Because, let's say, the Kuka seem to have left us in Switzerland, and we, let's say, generate a massacre. When in reality, let's say, those who destroyed and consumed the capital, impoverishing people, were them. In addition, this is also a reflection that I had during the last week. And it is much easier to destroy than to build. Since building requires a lot of time, that is why the effort to build has to be sustained over time. And we must not be fooled or conformed with achievements that are truly intermediate steps in our long way. If we think about it in terms of the Argentine situation, it is impossible to rebuild in a year and a half what has been destroyed almost a century ago. And therefore, it is also crucial that others do not demand that speed. That is to say, this is what is also very important to keep in mind. That building requires a lot of effort, a lot of work. But it also requires time, and destroying is much easier. That is why sometimes one also has this reaction towards those who only dedicate themselves to destroying, or who simply ignore. There are people who directly ignore the restrictions directly, and others who contemplate some restrictions. And only what we are here in the government, we know the restrictions that we face, and the kind of problems that are played out when one is in the real power. So we have been destroying for almost 100 years. That is why I really like the classification of long cycles of federal codomains. Who takes the Argentine case in cycles. He takes the 1853, 1943, 1943, 2003. Then he calls the first a liberal cycle, and it is in which Argentina, being a barbaric country, becomes a world power. 1943, 2003, 2023, sorry. The cycle in which, let's say, decadence, but clearly the last 20 years were the worst of that decadence, which is when we embrace the collectivist ideas. And the author wonders if the liberal cycle is coming now. Well, we are doing everything humanly possible to make that dream of Argentina grand possible again. And honestly, it is a huge job. And sometimes I think that there is no order of magnitude of what we are doing. I always say that we are doing the best government in history. And basically it is because there is a job called Passing the Buck by Gerardo de la Pava, and he does it together with Basali and Irigoy, in which he evaluates the different governments of Argentine history, and shows that until that moment, the best government in history had been the best government of Menem. And basically, if you look at it, let's say that government was characterized by two things: by a successful stabilization plan and by a set of structural reforms. And the reality is that we have managed to reduce inflation in a much faster way. First of all, with as you start to talk and criticize, we have a first big difference. We did it without expropriations. I mean, we didn't make a Bernex plan. I mean, some people should be more careful when evaluating the current program, especially if they were accomplices or benefited from them at the time of stabilization. Not only that, but, well, life is full of ungrateful people. some of you already understood. Also, not only that, we did it without expropriations. We didn't have the previous hyperinflation. Our two previous hyperinflations that destroyed all the financial assets. So it was obvious that the demand for money couldn't fall any lower in it did. And that's why stabilization was easier. We didn't look at the type of change either. I mean, because sometimes people from that government criticize us that we have the currency appreciated. And at that moment, the currency was much lower. It was very close to PPP, which would be a type of change of 700 pesos today. It's incredible because people from that time, let's say, complain about the type of change. But well, we already know how ungrateful people are. Not only that, but also, unlike other plans, which first adjusted the rates to later show a better achievement, we adjusted the rates during the process, and of an inflation that traveled to almost 1.5% daily, which manifested in a high price index in December of 54%, which annualized that gave 17,000, and that there were monetary conditions to validate an inflation of that caliber. In fact, Ario Conbag recently made an estimate of the monetary imbalance. How much was the potential inflation? And it gave him 18,000. So it's not that bad. And let's say today the inflation in Argentina at its peak travels at a rate between 20% and 25%. Not only that, let's say, if we look at Majors, it travels to less than 10%. If we look at Fade, food and drinks or the basic basket, let's say it travels to less than 10%. And clearly in a context where salaries grow systematically in real time since the month of April, something that allowed this government of insensitive and grow, let's say, to have taken out 12 million people from poverty and 2.5 million children from poverty. Well, we're doing things right. But not only that. If we take structural reforms, let's say by reform package, the reform is 28 times bigger than minimums. And if we take it by articulated, which is where it clearly counts, we've gone to an 80 times bigger reform than minimum. That is, we've done more than 8,000 structural reforms in a year and a half. So let's say, without a doubt, I'm eternally grateful to the entire government team, because without a doubt, we're making the best government in history. Thank you. But in short, what we have to be clear is that despite all these major achievements, taking the country forward will take time. I mean, we're not going to become a developed country overnight. Convergence processes can last 30, 35, 40 years. So it's not only a matter of hard work, but we also have to be patient. We have to be perseverant. And that's why the cultural battle is so important. I mean, management is important. The political battle is fundamental. Thank you, Bas, for everything you're doing. But without the cultural battle, we're not going to be able to sustain the reforms in time. This is going to require a continuous fight, a continuous struggle. Let's say, to be continuously. Even the light, let's say, a beacon of light in the background, let's say, where we want to go. And that's what we have to talk about. In other words, in addition to having a clear north, it's fundamental to have the strength and the will and the patience necessary to reach our destination. That's why we have to be aware that the struggle is constant. There will always be new objectives to reach, and new challenges will always arise that we must overcome. And that's why it's so important that the huge task of the Faro Foundation in the active defense of the ideas of freedom, ideas in which any government quickly loses its course and falls into the trap of socialism. I see around me many of the present, and also those who preceded me in the word, and I find the common denominator. We do not arise from politics or the state, but we are, first of all, Argentinian citizens. We are patriots concerned with the destiny of our country. Having reached where we have reached is a living prefix of our society. Can must take the public place. We show you that to make a difference, you have to get involved in the mud of the debate, and why not also in politics. We are clear that we cannot continue being mere spectators, because if we do not actively defend ourselves, the cast will pass us by. I always say it, the goals are not made by the tribune, but by the players on the court. And although we believe that we can do little, the difference between doing little and not doing anything is already infinite. That is why Diego Ricalda, Mike Bayagiona, and Ramiro Castanera are a great example to follow, because they not only take care of their private activities, but they make every day the efforts to expose their ideas in public and attack the infinite pay voice actors of the state party. And from now on, they do all this with great personal and often professional cost. That is why I say welcome to the voice actors of freedom. They and many others are fully involved in a minefield of political discussion to defend positions silenced by the parasitic caste, because the cultists of the state do everything they can so that the only ideas that reach the people are theirs. The nasty ideas that produce the criminal model of poverty and submission, making a historical parallelism. In ancient Greece, the free men were those who could participate in the public debate, and for them free time was needed. Something that the slaves did not have, to be working from sun to sun. In Argentina in recent decades something similar happened. Honest citizens were forced to work more and more to sustain with taxes the extravagant lives of politicians. And of course, they took advantage of the excess of free time to happily go free television channels, promoting their own confiscatory ideas, so that the political left has a structural advantage in the cultural battle, because supported in the favor that political power gives. It dedicated itself for decades to infiltrate into all possible institutions, subverting its values and molding them to promote this agenda, an operation that would be invisible to many if it were not for the huge contribution of my great friend and executive director of this foundation, Agustín. Thus, the politicians, the businessmen, the trade unions, the laborers, and the entire broadcast ended up repeating the same set of ideas, almost as if it were a chip in the brain, which are ideas contrary to the most basic notions of freedom. This is what Axel Kaiser. Tear of these, congratulations for your work. Since we are applauding, let's also applaud Adrian Rabier, who is also going to be our candidate in La Pampa. And that Axel developed widely in his book, Carcitas Mentales, which I suggest that you read emphatically. I mean, come on, break the chanchito. These ideas that at first glance seem innocent, and that feed on our good intentions, but that in the long run lead to misery. Ideas that are promoted actively in the political world, we stay in parastatal propaganda, and that have as a purpose to legitimize the unlimited expansion of the public sector. Of course, when I talk about mental parasites, I don't mean people. People are victims of these ideas that are placed in the brain by force of decades of collectivist indoctrination. The point is that once the ideas are put into practice, and these mental parasites take over their minds, the more they take over their minds, the problem is that they turn them into zombies. I mean, they turn them into a sect, which is basically what the Q sect is. I mean, it doesn't matter what data they present. I mean, for example, he present the inflation data, and they say, no, they are lying about inflation. I mean, you present the poverty data, and they say, no, if they are lying about poverty. Of course, if they had directly eliminated the indicator, why was it stigmatizing? Because in the end, and extending to other planes, the thief creates all of them in the same condition. And he clarified, also extending to other planes. He wants to understand, let them understand. His face shot with color, and you understand everything I'm saying. Well, let's say I already clarified it. The first example of a mental parasite is the notion of social justice, which has nothing to do with social justice, given that it is part of injustice to take away one person by force to give another. I mean, it steals a person's job to distribute arbitrarily. I mean, it has two problems. It has the theft opposite, and it has the same treatment against the law. And that, in the end, it is neither more nor less than making charity with foreign money. And this, naturally, leads us to another mental parasite, which is the notion of social rights. These are the first two chapters of Alex's book. According to this parasite, from each difference, whatever it is, a supposed right is born, which can only be resolved by means of state intervention, that it is public spending paid with present or future taxes. The point is that, thanks to God, the differences are infinite between each one of us. And I say thank God, because if they weren't, there wouldn't be division of labor, and consequently, there wouldn't be social and economic cooperation, efficient or prosperous. The point of arrival from this perspective is the total state intervention and the total appropriation of the private product for its future distribution. In other words, applying this idea in its last consequences leads to totalitarianism. I was going to be anticipating the other part of the speech, and I remembered, and now, let's say, I say, for now, I don't deviate. I deviate in a while. In addition, I wouldn't even reach it, because it is something that is logically contradictory. The inflation of rights generates expectations and limitations in people, and authorizes and demands the state to meet those expectations. The problem is that rights must be paid, and while people's expectations are infinite, resources are finite. In other words, in order to meet such a gap, we would have to break the first law of the economy, which is the law of scarcity. As Thomas Shaw says, first law of the economy is the scarcity of resources. The first law of the economy is the scarcity. In other words, there is nothing for everyone. And what is the first law of politics? It is to violate the first law of the economy. I say something that we have learned a lot from. Because the other day, I'm trying to moderate my words. There was a subject. Let's say with a feather crowned, who basically said, no, a plan is not only the tax balance. with which to enable tax to generate. Because in the end, that say deficit zero is a policy. And this is called respecting the budget restriction. And not respecting the budget restriction was very expensive for us Argentines. In fact, 123 years prior to our arrival to the government, let's say except in 10 periods, there was always deficit. Always. But what did not happen was because we were on default. So it was false that we were not deficit. So I say, if for 123 years no one could do it, and we came in, we did it, which in addition to saying that it was impossible, for example, that it was impossible to lower public spending at 1 point of the GDP, and we, in the first month, we made an adjustment of 7 points of the GDP. That is, public spending in real terms went down more than 30%. And they said it was impossible. Then some games were recomposed. The final adjustment ended up being 5 points of the GDP, and that was achieved in a month. This is interesting because Federico Steisinger did a study on tax adjustments from the middle of the 20th century to here. And there are only 24 cases in which public spending of this might achieve is lowered. The interesting thing is that the remaining 23 cases were after a war. That is, which is quite clear. God raises the expense by the war expense, and the war ends and the expense is lowered. Therefore, if we have done something that has never been done in recent history, then not only that, if we also add the adjustment in the balance of the central bank of 10 points of the GDP, basically it is the largest tax adjustment in the history of humanity, made in 6 months. Thanks here. And here I also want to make a note of color, because in one of the interviews that Toto gave, which are all very good, but there are some things that already exceed the extraordinary, and that also shows the enormous task of this other colossus that is here, which is Santiago, also the president of the central bank. At one point he points out, because we had a fiscal deficit of 15 points of GDP, and 5 were in the treasury, and 10 were in the central bank. And this is very interesting, because what Toto shows is that even when we have made the adjustment in the fiscal year, if we had not fixed the disaster of the central bank, the hyperinflation would not have happened the same, with the aggravating factor that, in addition, they would have told us that we had a hyperinflation, even making the fiscal adjustment. Imagine what they would be in terms of cultural battle. The most interesting thing about all this is that when first they said it was impossible, then when they started to see it, they said it was not sustainable, then they started to say that we were going to sink into a tremendous recession, and that, let's say, that could also be understandable in light of the bibliography that exists in the matter. The most interesting thing is that we made tremendous adjustments. And the most incredible thing, and the reason why in the world we talk about the Argentine miracle, is that in the first year, if you compare December 24 with December 23, the gross product rose by 6%. So we have something to say and to contribute. We have to make an adjustment that lowers inflation, that is not recessive, and that takes out a quarter of the population of poverty. Let's go back to the issue of mental parasites. These mental parasites hide in a deformation are the concept of freedom. If for liberalism, there is no project of life in an equal context. For collectivism, there is only freedom. If there is a guarantee of success for all, the left is not conceive that as individuals are so very, everyone will make use of their freedom as they seem and will live with the consequences. What happens is that when you take the definition of freedom, for example, Hague, freedom is that you can, when you are affecting others, you are free to do whatever you want. Now, yes, you also have to take care of costs. That is, freedom and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. But well, what are they going to talk about responsibility to guys who drive a 2.8 fiscal hole in the PBI? That is, there was more canapé per year. The sensitive ones. I mean, for them, everyone should be able to access the same assets. This should be the state that administers the lives of the individuals, passing from equality to the law that proposes liberalism to a context of evil called equality of opportunities, where, as we saw, everything that makes us unique as individuals vanishes. To top it off, the elite is saying, to defend diversity in plurality, one of these things is that they violate the budget restriction. I mean, the interpretation we have about this mental parasite is that the issue of social rights appears, let's say, in front of the failure of the parasite. I just got a hair in my eye, and you don't know what bothers me, but still, not as much as to continue increasing the number of insults. Let's say, of course, let's say I'm going to do this. I'm going to stop using insults to see if they're able to discuss ideas, because I think they should discuss the forms, because they lack enough intellectual level to discuss ideas. Thank you. I want to make a note of Kali. There was a man, he was president, who, let's say, was a serial insulter. They called him the crazy one. And he was the one who transformed Argentina's education. The man was called Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, according to a set of exaggerated and exquisite forms. He would have been directly sentenced to death. But well, that's how it is. Let's say the dictatorship reforms. Let's face it, respecting their forms once and for all to see if they show intellectual level to be able to give us the battle and ideas. Because, let's say, the only thing they do is, since they can give us ideas, they push themselves on forms. So, let's say, now we are challenging them. Now we are going to use the forms. Does he like, in a way, to show that they are an empty shell? But these ideas that sound nice, and let's say, about equality of opportunities and so on, they raise a story called Hausen by Jason, by Kurt Bonekitz, that portrays a perfectly egalitarian world, where there is a general discapacitor whose job is to make sure that no one is more intelligent than anyone, stronger than anyone, faster than anyone, or cuter than anyone. Those who had a particular busy had to weigh a horrible mess or file lawsuits. See you, let's say, to fame them. And the most intelligent had to wear an iPhone that made squeaking sound, that prevented them from thinking. That is infinite. That is the utopia that the socialists propose. I mean, in the end, it's like, as I know, equality of opportunities. So I don't know. It happens that now I like to play tennis. So let's say to be able to have equality of opportunities, I had the privilege of welcoming Djokovic in our livos. I think I would have liked, let's say, to dress as a tennis player and play a game with him. Now equality of opportunities, let's say, could have made transitories or permanent ones. I'm going to go through the transitories because they are not so serious, but I would have had to have chained an arm, a leg, and Djokovic played like that. Well, imagine these hypotheses of equality in a basketball team. I mean, this is interesting because in the basketball team, I mean clearly, those who are taller has some advantage rate. So what would they do? What would they do? They would cut their legs until they were all the same height as Mike. Of course, but Mike wants to play basketball. He has to have equality of opportunities. And this, let's say, beyond, let's say, that I can make these jokes to Mike because I'm his friend. There. He didn't make you offended, right? Let's see if he still sue me because he felt offended. Let's see if he think that I want to make an institutional attack on your knee roll and fund this on fire. That. But beyond that, there is something that is very interesting because when you make these questions to the socialist, they will never accept, let's say, that they equalize down. They will never accept that. They say that equality is up. The problem is that this is false because it violates the budget restriction. Of course, let's say that I have an economy that produces 100 and there is a group that takes 20 and another that takes 80. Well, what happens if I want both to have the same? Well, in principle, I couldn't have a situation in which both take 80. Because for both to take 80, I would have to produce 160. I will have to produce 100. The first thing that will happen to me is that I violate the budget restriction. In other words, violating the budget restriction is not heartless. It's not that one wants to respect the budget restriction because it is no heart, because it is not sensitive, but because the solution to deny the budget restriction is much worse. Because the attempt to deny 50, the problem is that the one that generates for 80 will not be willing to pay 50. So what is it going to do? It's going to adjust its production, the 50. Let's say that the other one did not produce for 50. Therefore, what is going to happen is that they are going to go to 70. And if you, with this dynamics, insist, what they are going to do is that they are talented. Something that socialists always do. They end up expelling talents of people, but also the violation of the budget restriction, or they finance it with debt. That is, with future taxes. That is, condemning the misery to future generations, like what the populist demagogues at the Congress did. Or they finance it with monetary emission, and they end up taking away 3 zeros from the currency, and we could take out 3 more. And not only that, they also condemn the most vulnerable to misery, a group that is among the most vulnerable, the older adults. Or, without another repair, raise the explicit taxes, with which, let's say, they end up attacking economic rise. In short, the remedy ends up being worse than the disease. There is a wonderful phrase by Haig that says, if socialists knew about economics, they wouldn't be socialists. That is, economic knowledge leads to liberalism. But These people are zombies. That is why I trust now that we take the Leviathan, not less titanic than being, I'll say, because a state party runs with decades of advantage. It has been inoculating decades in our population these mental parasites that have become common sense and have become common sense for many people who have not voted any version of collectivism in their lives. The Apparenism, Quixorism, Socialism, Social Democrat, or even communists like the Soviet dwarf, Kichilov. We have the mandate to disarm the tentacular structure that the state has set up to get into all aspects of people's lives. This who, as Picasso did in ancient Greece, cut people's legs, they shape their ideal twisted of equality and to fill their minds with mental parasites. The case of Picasso is interesting. Picasso is a person who was deeply involved in equality. This is interesting. As a metaphor, Picasso invited people to his house, invited them to dinner, and gave them something to drink so that they could stay drunk when they were already very drunk. Picasso was so generous that he invited them to stay to sleep. If they were very tall, he would cut their legs. If they were very wide, he would cut their arms. If they were very short, he would stretch them. Picasso was a bloodthirsty person. That's what equality is about. That's what equality is about. It's deeply violent, bloodthirsty, and above all, impoverishing. Therefore, but if we only focus on reforming the national state and neglecting the provinces and municipalities, these districts will serve as a refuge, serve as agents of the caste, can guard themselves during the storm. From there is no doubt that they will gather forces to then undo everything that has been achieved. They already admit that they plan to become worse. In fact, they openly admit that they are going to become worse. One day I saw a tweet that when the delegated faculties had finished and Federico published all the agents that had been eliminated, one of these zombies from the sect jumped out and sighed, "Here is the government program with the next government, which is to break everything that this government does. In other words, their proposal is only to destroy. So, let's say, we will have to continue fighting, not only to defend what we have achieved, but also to continue building. In fact, without going any further, today Kichilov dedicates a good part of the budget in the province of Buenos Aires to feed an army without any function. As if this were not enough, it is also a luxury to finance all the streaming channels of the country, even if they have 10 reproductions. In other words, even he, who does not know much about thinking, knows how important it is to constantly fight. In the kingdom of ideas and culture, the province of Buenos Aires is its place where the propaganda apparatus of Kichilov has done real damage, infecting the minds of millions of people living in the most abject misery, still held captive by Kichilovism. The power of ideas and these mental parasites is such that under the illusion of social justice and rights, it leads entire societies to the precipice. That is why these legislative elections in September must make the reality itself speak. We have to ask the people of Buenos Aires to look around and evaluate what has happened with the province in recent decades, and in the municipalities that look, for example, at the management of people like my dear friend Diego Valenzuela. The election have to be a space for people to express whether or not the provinces have improved over all this time, whether the security has improved or not, whether they walk every day with more tranquility on the street or not, whether they have invested in improving the quality of the essential services that a state has to ensure. That is, whether the people's money has been wasted on miscellaneous matters, leaving the most basic needs unattended. Finally, the people of Buenos Aires must decide whether the disproportionate and costly provincial state is serve the welfare of society, or on the contrary, to pay more and more taxes, to pay the salary to Nakai, who did not work, friends of Kicillof, or militants of Kicillof, or militants of the parasitism of the state party. Therefore, I repeat, this is precisely the election that the people of Buenos Aires will have on September 7, to say no to decades after decades that we had in the province of Buenos Aires, that today it is in charge of the useless and circle of Kicillof, useless and spherical because it is useless. They look at it wherever they look at it. To say no to confiscatory taxes, to say no to a state that spends on stupidities but fails to meet its basic needs, and to say never again to the Chaserism, the government experiment, with which he insists decades ago, but in the province only, to failure after failure. Here I also want to make a note of color and optimism regarding what is coming electorally. This election is fundamental, not only in the province of Buenos Aires, but it is fundamental for all Argentines of good, because it could mean the end of Chaserism. Here there is something that is very important to note in this election. Provincial. It is much more than a district what is played. But we must take into account that they are taking into account the false and the moral fraud. That is the testimonial candidates. Not only that, the intendants are going out to play on the field, putting all the equipment, and they are also willing to make fraud, and they also vote with a different electoral system that enables fraud. Therefore, this election is important because it will mean the race of Chaserism, and for us, it will mean the floor, because the national election will not have testimonials, whereas there will be, they are ours, and it will be voted with another system. It will be voted with a single paper ballot, let's say a system that supposedly harms officials, and the only ones who had the courage to vote the single paper ballot were us liberals. Therefore, what happens, let's say, in September, for us it will be a floor. This means that from here to October, we will continue to grow up. But the most important of all is that we have this opportunity, and we have the one in October, and we have the one in October. That the most important of all is that we have this opportunity, that the most important of all is that we have this opportunity, and we have the one in October, but they have this floor. That's why the ships are burning. That's why the giant levels of operations that each of the people who are part of this government are suffering. That's why the giant levels of operations that each of the people who are part of this government are suffering. Because if in September we get to win the province of Buenos Aires, we will have the last deal. In the case of Quasrismo, and going back to the relevant issues, also, of the province of Buenos Aires, also of the province of Buenos Aires, linked with the sacred scriptures. The prophet Isaiah tells of a time in which the kingdom of Judea was submerged in a deep social and religious corruption. He tells that God repented to the Jewish people and said to them, when they extend their hands in prayer, I will take my eyes off you, and even when they offer me multiple prayers, I will not hear them, because their hands are full of blood. And that's not what the province of Buenos Aires is, a province where the government has their hands full of blood, because the province of Buenos Aires is a tree path of blood. Deep down, what this fragment is saying is that the quality of man is defined by his actions. We can have good ideas, or we can have good intentions, but what matters in the end is to perform good actions. There's a very interesting quote from Milton Friedman that says that economic policies are not judged by their intentions, but by their results. Hence, a government is characterized by an extreme thelaudism, which in some cases we are proud of. Actually, we are all galvanized. We had to pull. Someone had to put a bit of measure. And it wasn't going to be me. So it's not about who we think we're, it's what we do that defines us. I'm going to give another example. Not only do we talk about freedom, but also, when we had to stabilize, we respected the right to property because we didn't make a boundaries plan. We didn't put in price controls. We didn't call businessmen. And we press people so that prices don't go up, much less putting an item on the table. Who send the police to chase level trees? What? I think that what best shows our commitment in terms of designing public policies, which are policies taught from a moral and ethical point of view, is what happened with the SIPO. All the economic team, let's say it, was strongly committed to eliminate the SIPO. The SIPO basically is a torture tool, and it was very good that it was called SIPO, because basically, if you, let's say, I need money, honestly, you would have to be able to spend what you want. You don't have to come any official to tell you that you can buy or you can't buy, and that has consequences, not only on your level of utility, let's say in economic terms, in friendly terms, satisfaction, but also that also destroys your savings. Think that if you, let's say in the year 2001, you had the possibility to stay with 1350 pesos today, because it will continue to go down, well, to do it well, 1360. So you had, let's say, you had 1360 pesos, and you could stay with $1, with $1360, or with 1360 pesos. If he stayed with $1360, today you had $1360. If he stayed with 1360 pesos, today you would have only $1. Later you will be able to buy more dollars, but it doesn't matter. That's another detail that will come later. Hands, with which that implies that you had destroyed your wealth. That is, you had deteriorated the quality of life enormously. That is to say, another lie shows the dollar because I hate it. That say the country, but actually I chose the dollar because with just reason I hated politicians. who were the ones who issued it. I remember that. It had been about 6 months that I had been a congressman, and the journalist asked me what she thought, now that he was in politics, what he thought about politics, and I told him that I had been wrong. So the journalist went out to recriminate me. He said this, he said that. Let's say now that he isn't here, he changed his opinion. So I told him, wait, I'm going to clarify something. Actually, my opinion about politics is not better. My opinion now is that it is much worse than I thought before. And the interesting thing is that we had clearly defined that we wanted to go out. We, both in the Ministry of Economy, that here is the giant Jose Luis Daza. He had made his estimations. I think there is also the rest. He is furious. He is silent. There is the Ocon. There is here Vladi. There was the estimation of how many dollars he needed to leave the central, and there was what I thought that we needed. So we had reached the consensus. That was $12,000 million we could open. But like Toto and I in this, we are hyper villagers. So we said, well, if we get 15,000 million, we go out. Well, the program ended up being bigger. So what was it that they said? No, they're not going to leave in any way. They are not going to be encouraged to go to floating or to release the SIPO in an electoral year. That is to say, they believed that there was a utilitarian vision of life. They believed that for us, embracing freedom was only a matter of having a bigger PPI, and what they did not understand was that we designed the policies with a moral perspective, with an ethical perspective, and therefore, if the dollars appeared, what electoral year, and what speculation, let's say, freedom is not negotiated for a minute, and when we were able to open the SIPO, even though it was an electoral year, and against everything that the state and the caste party said, we opened the SIPO successfully. But let's say, given that we are talking about that we have to put the last nail and the coffin of Chicanism, we have to go back, let's say, to what Chicanism has done, what it did with the country and with the province. Let's say, talk, let's say anger. They have no way of hiding before the eyes of God or the people, because they have destroyed everything they have touched. That is to say, the king would be saddened. The king Midas. Everything he touched became gold. This everything that touched became, well, in excrement is fine. That is any bonner and see. No matter where he lives, he looks around and knows that the province is the same, or Western in the last century. It does not matter that they filled their mouths speaking of solidarity with grandiloquent speeches, if at the time of truth, in the facts, they're willing to break the stay and ruin the future of all, know that not only God, but also the people will evaluate them for what they do, not for what they say, because in the end, as the old saying says, the way to hell, they're devoid of good intentions. The Argentinians decided to leave behind the quasi hell, and I hope they do so in this September 7, that say in the elections. In short, this is the adversary with which we face, and that is why it is so important. The work of foundations like Faro I want to point out a moment. In the name of the foundation, it is conceived in honor of Benjamin Solari Parvicini. He spoke that Argentina would be lighthouse of lights, the first lighthouse of a new era. And what does a lighthouse do? Illuminates the way, marks a north, a point of arrival so that the boat stranded can approach the port. And that is precisely what the foundation Faro is steering through its different initiatives. The Diadon is its name and its purpose, and besides, to present its new speakers in the cultural battle, they also announce in a project as ambitious as necessary, a Council of Freedom. It will be a true order of knights dedicated to sinking the liberal reforms that the provinces need to accompany the nation on the path of freedom that we have undertaken, and that therefore have the huge task of creating those products of statism that operate like a shunt, facing an economy that has all the ingredients to take off. In summary, through the Council of Freedom, this foundation will create lighthouse that works at local level, in charge of illuminating until the last corner of Argentina with the City of Freedom, sent by its house mother, the foundation itself, which is the lighthouse of lights, and nothing better to achieve this. I would like to thank the team, agents of the private sector, those who are used to interact with the Byzantine system set up by the political caste and its partners, because they are the ones who know exactly how these nobility privileges, in the form of law, oppress the entire citizenry, to favor private interests, because the privates are the true patriots silenced by the system, those who work every day, a better quality at a low price, not those who are called patriots, but only now have to steal from some, to give half to others, and stay with the difference. And that is why private citizens are indicated, those who have both knowledge and the will to carry out this titanic task. This group of reforms will have the key role of designing projects of different types for the particular situation of each province. I am sure they will be very useful for the legislative agendas of the years to come. I am talking about the agenda of freedom, yes, but I also allow myself the dream and think I hope to generate a contagion effect, and other political forces find value in these projects. Why not? It is always necessary a compass behind which I direct and give content to political efforts, because if the goal is to lower taxes and make our economy more efficient so that it is the freest and most competitive in the world, we need to immerse ourselves in the reality of each province to understand what ridiculous regulations make it worse, what local taxes suffice, or how many are left in the subnational state. They already do it, because it is the municipality that has the lowest number of employees per capita, and I hope that you beat them in the first round. We already learned from the past that efforts to change the country cannot be timid. They have to be ambitious and profound. They have to occur the reach, and they have to be inclusive of the provincial and even the municipal. They cash for those who produce, or trade for those who work, for those who employ, innovate, and undertake. Their economic reality is one. They can or have to separate the national from the local, and it requires that at all levels, the path to greater freedom is walked. For all this, I want to thank the Faro Foundation, my dear friend Augustin, Adrian Ravia, who has also participated in this cultural battle, defending the ideas of the Austrian school, Axel Kaiser, the giant Toto Cafuta, who has patronized this project, and the icon of orthodoxy, the leaping genius who will take it forward. I want to tell you that you have my most sincere thanks and my total support. Nothing more appropriate for a patriot than to fight to take forward freedom to his fellow citizens. In the end, may God bless you all. May the forces of heaven be with us. And long life freedom, damn it. Long life freedom. Thanks you all.